Judge Angela Morrison had been looking forward to this evening all week. After spending 12 hours reviewing complex legal cases, she was finally heading home to her quiet neighborhood. She had changed out of her formal judicial robes hours ago and was now wearing a simple blue sweater and jeans. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she looked like any other professional woman driving home after a long day. The autumn sun was setting as she drove down the familiar stretch of highway. Angela kept her music low and her speed exactly at the limit. She had learned long ago that being a black woman meant being extra careful about everything, especially when driving. Her late father, a civil rights lawyer, had taught her that lesson when she was just 16 years old. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Angela's heart sank, but she remained calm. She carefully pulled over to the shoulder, turned off her engine, and placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. This wasn't her first traffic stop, though she couldn't understand why she was being pulled over. She had been driving exactly at the speed limit and hadn't broken any traffic laws. Two officers approached her car. The first was a tall, stocky man with graying hair, who walked with the swagger of someone who had been doing this job for many years. The second was younger, with short brown hair and an eager expression that suggested he was trying to prove himself. Both wore the standard blue uniforms of the city police department. The older officer knocked on her window with more force than necessary. Angela rolled it down slowly and kept her hands visible. "Good evening, officers. How can I help you?" "License and registration," the older officer demanded without any greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp and unfriendly from the very beginning. Angela reached slowly for her purse, announcing each movement. "I'm reaching for my wallet now." She pulled out her driver's license and registration, handing them through the window with steady hands. The officer grabbed the documents and studied them for much longer than necessary. He held them up to the light, turned them over, and squinted at them as if they were written in a foreign language. The younger officer leaned in to look as well, both of them whispering to each other just loud enough that Angela could hear their suspicious tones, but not their exact words. "These look funny to me," the older officer finally said, though Angela knew her documents were perfectly legitimate. She had renewed her license just 6 months ago at the DMV. "Step out of the car." Angela felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this was escalating beyond a simple traffic stop, but she also knew that arguing would only make things worse. "May I ask what I'm being stopped for, officer?" "I said step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. The younger officer moved to the passenger side of her vehicle, effectively boxing her in. Angela realized that what had started as a routine evening drive home was turning into something much more serious. She could feel the weight of years of legal training telling her to document everything, to remember every detail. But she was also acutely aware that she was a black woman alone on a highway with 2 hostile police officers. She opened her door slowly and stepped out, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The cool evening air hit her face as she stood beside her car, trying to project calm confidence despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Is there a problem with my driving?" Angela asked politely. "I was going exactly the speed limit." The older officer looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "We'll be the judge of that. Turn around and put your hands on the car." This was clearly excessive for a simple traffic violation, but Angela complied. She placed her palms flat against the roof of her sedan and tried to remain calm. In her mind, she was already cataloging the officers' behavior, noting their failure to explain the reason for the stop and their immediate escalation to what felt like a hostile encounter. The younger officer began walking around her car, peering into the windows with his flashlight even though it wasn't fully dark yet. "Nice car," he commented with a tone that suggested he found something suspicious about her vehicle. It was a modest Honda Accord, nothing flashy or expensive, but apparently even that was enough to raise their suspicions. Angela worked hard to keep her voice steady. "Officers, I'm happy to cooperate, but could you please tell me why I was stopped? I don't believe I was speeding or violating any traffic laws." The older officer stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath. "You were swerving back there. Looked like you might be under the influence." Angela knew this was completely false. She hadn't had anything to drink and had been driving in a perfectly straight line. She was also aware that this accusation was often used as a pretext for more invasive searches and procedures. Her legal training kicked in, and she mentally noted this as the first clear lie in what she suspected would be many. "I haven't been drinking, officer. I'm happy to take any sobriety test you'd like to administer." The two officers exchanged a look that Angela didn't like. There was something in their expressions that suggested they had already decided how this encounter was going to go, regardless of her cooperation or innocence. As she stood there with her hands on her car, watching the sunset behind the trees along the highway, Angela had no idea that in less than 24 hours, these same two officers would be standing in her courtroom, looking up at her as she sat behind the judge's bench in her black robes. She had no way of knowing that this humiliating encounter was about to become a powerful lesson in how justice sometimes works in unexpected ways. The traffic stop that had started as a simple drive home from work was about to change everything. Angela stood perfectly still beside her car, her hands flat against the cool metal surface of the roof. She had been in this position for nearly 10 minutes now, and both officers seemed to be taking their time, almost as if they were enjoying making her wait. The evening air was getting colder, but she didn't dare move to get her jacket from inside the car. The older officer was still examining her driver's license, holding it up to the streetlight that had just flickered on. He squinted at it, turned it over multiple times, and even bent it slightly as if testing whether it was real. Angela watched him from the corner of her eye, knowing full well that her license was completely legitimate and wondering what game he was playing. "This address on here, where is that exactly?" the officer asked, though Angela knew he could easily verify any address he wanted through his radio or patrol car computer. "It's in Riverside Heights," she answered calmly. "About 15 minutes from here." The younger officer had finished his circle around her car and was now standing near her back bumper. "Riverside Heights, huh? That's a pretty expensive neighborhood. What do you do for work?" Angela hesitated for a moment. Her instinct was to identify herself as a judge, but something told her that might make things worse rather than better. Some officers didn't like being reminded that there were people with authority over them, especially when they were in the middle of what felt like a power trip. "I work in the legal field," she said carefully. Both officers seemed to find this amusing. The older one chuckled and shook his head. "Legal field. That's fancy talk." He stepped closer to her. "You know what I'm smelling right now?" Angela's heart sank. She knew exactly where this was heading, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "No, sir. Marijuana. I'm smelling marijuana coming from your vehicle." The officer's voice had taken on a more official tone now, as if he was already preparing for a report he would have to write later. This was completely impossible. Angela had never used marijuana in her life, and nobody had been smoking anything in or around her car. Her vehicle was meticulously clean, and she was careful about everything from the air fresheners she used to the cleaning products. But she knew that once an officer claimed to smell drugs, it gave them legal justification to search her vehicle, regardless of whether the smell actually existed. "Officer, I can assure you there are no drugs in my car," Angela said, keeping her voice as respectful as possible. "I don't use marijuana, and nobody who rides in my car uses it either." The younger officer laughed. "Well, we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" They ordered her to step back from the vehicle, and both officers began searching her car. They opened every door, pulled out the floor mats, opened the glove compartment, and dumped out the contents of her center console. They searched under the seats, in the trunk, and even removed her spare tire to look in the wheel well. Angela stood on the sidewalk watching them tear apart her car. They weren't being careful with her belongings. Her work files scattered across the pavement, her emergency roadside kit was dumped out, and they handled her personal items with obvious disrespect. She watched one of them pick up her courthouse parking pass and toss it aside without even reading it. 20 minutes into their search, it was clear they weren't finding anything because there was nothing to find. Angela could see the frustration growing on both their faces. The older officer was getting rougher with her belongings, and the younger one kept looking at his partner as if waiting for direction on what to do next. "Maybe she hid it really well," the younger officer suggested. "Maybe she swallowed it," the older one replied, and Angela felt a chill at the implication. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes of searching, they had to admit they hadn't found anything. Her car was completely legal, just as she had told them from the beginning. But instead of apologizing or letting her go, Both officers seemed even more frustrated than before. "Where are the drugs?" the older officer demanded, as if Angela was hiding something obvious. "There are no drugs," Angela replied patiently. "I told you that from the beginning." The officer stepped uncomfortably close to her. "Don't lie to me. We know you had something in that car." Angela felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she knew she had to remain calm. Losing her temper now could escalate this situation into something truly dangerous. "Officer, you've searched my entire vehicle. You can see that there's nothing there. I haven't lied to you about anything." But the officers seemed determined to find some way to justify what they had already put her through. The younger one was looking through her scattered paperwork, and the older one was staring at her with obvious hostility. "You know what I think?" the older officer said. "I think you were acting suspicious during this whole stop. I think you were being uncooperative." Angela couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had been nothing but polite and cooperative from the very first moment. She had followed every instruction, answered every question, and allowed them to search her car, even though she knew they had no real justification for it. "How exactly was I being uncooperative?" she asked, genuinely curious about his answer. "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped back. And that's when Angela realized that this traffic stop was never really about her driving or any suspicion of drugs. This was about power, about control, and about making sure she knew her place. She was a black woman who drove a nice car and lived in a good neighborhood, and that was apparently enough to make her a target. The two officers were now standing close together, whispering about something. Angela couldn't hear their exact words, but she could see them looking at her and nodding to each other. Whatever they were planning, she had a feeling she wasn't going to like it. As she stood there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the contents of her car scattered across the ground, Angela had no idea that tomorrow she would be looking down at these same officers from her judge's bench. She couldn't have imagined that this humiliating encounter was about to become a story of justice that would inspire people across the country. But first, her night was about to get much worse. After their whispered conversation, both officers turned back toward Angela with expressions that made her stomach drop. She had been hoping that since they found nothing in her car, this nightmare would finally be over. Instead, she could see in their faces that they were just getting started. The older officer pulled out his handcuffs. The metallic sound as he unfolded them seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet evening air. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Angela felt the world tilt slightly. "I'm sorry, what? Why am I being arrested?" "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," the officer said matter-of-factly, as if these charges made perfect sense. Angela's legal mind immediately kicked into high gear. She had not obstructed anything, and she certainly had not resisted arrest since she wasn't even being arrested until this very moment. The circular logic would have been laughable if it weren't so serious. "You can't resist an arrest that hasn't happened yet." "Officer, I need to respectfully point out that I have been completely cooperative throughout this entire stop," Angela said, her voice still steady despite the panic she felt rising in her chest. "I followed every instruction, allowed you to search my vehicle, and answered all your questions. I haven't resisted anything." The younger officer stepped closer. "You were argumentative. You kept questioning our authority." Angela thought back through the entire encounter. She had asked why she was being stopped, which was her constitutional right. She had asked what they were looking for when they searched her car. She had asked how she had been uncooperative when accused of being so. These were reasonable questions, not arguments or resistance. "I was exercising my constitutional rights by asking questions," she said carefully. "That's not the same as being argumentative or resisting arrest." The older officer grabbed her arm roughly. "Turn around now or we'll add assault on a police officer to the charges." Angela knew she was trapped. If she continued to point out the obvious problems with their accusations, they would claim she was being even more resistant. If she tried to physically defend herself when they grabbed her, they would claim she was assaulting them. She was in a no-win situation, and she suspected that was exactly what they wanted. She turned around slowly and put her hands behind her back. The handcuffs were cold and tight against her wrists. The officer who put them on made them deliberately snug, tight enough that they dug into her skin uncomfortably. Angela bit her lip to keep from crying out. "You have the right to remain silent," the older officer began, reciting her Miranda rights in a bored tone that suggested he had done this many times before. But Angela barely heard the words. She was thinking about how she would explain this arrest to her colleagues, to the attorneys who appeared before her court, to the media if word got out that a sitting judge had been arrested. As they walked her toward the patrol car, Angela looked back at her own vehicle. Her belongings were still scattered all over the ground. Her work files were blowing around in the evening breeze. Her car doors were still open and her trunk was still up. It looked like the scene of an accident or a crime. "What about my car?" she asked. "We'll have it towed," the younger officer said with what sounded like satisfaction. "Can I at least get my purse and lock the doors?" "No, you're under arrest. You don't get to touch anything." Angela realized that they were going to leave her car completely open and unattended on the side of the highway, with her personal belongings scattered around it. Anyone could take anything they wanted, or someone could plant something in her vehicle while she was gone. But she was powerless to do anything about it. The back seat of the patrol car smelled like disinfectant and fear. Angela had to sit sideways because of the handcuffs, and the plastic seat was uncomfortable and cramped. As they pulled away from the curb, she watched her car disappear in the distance, still open and vulnerable. During the 20-minute drive to the police station, the two officers talked quietly in the front seat. Angela couldn't hear most of their conversation, but she caught fragments that made her blood run cold. They were discussing their report, making sure their stories matched up. They were talking about her attitude and her suspicious behavior. They were constructing a narrative that would justify everything they had done. Angela stared out the window at the familiar streets of her city. These were roads she drove every day on her way to work, neighborhoods where she had friends and colleagues. Now she was seeing them from the back of a police car, heading toward a jail cell, and it felt surreal. When they arrived at the station, the booking process began immediately. Angela was photographed and fingerprinted like any other criminal. The desk sergeant processed her paperwork without looking at her twice. To everyone in that building, she was just another arrest, another person who had allegedly broken the law. The older officer filled out the arrest report while Angela sat in a holding area. She could see him writing, and she wondered what story he was telling on paper. How do you explain arresting someone for resisting an arrest that hadn't happened yet? How do you justify obstruction charges when the person cooperated with every request? But Angela was beginning to understand that the truth wasn't really the point. The point was power. The point was making sure she knew that despite her education, her position, her careful behavior, and her respectful attitude, she was still vulnerable. She could still be humiliated, arrested, and processed through the system like anyone else. As she sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair, waiting for whatever came next, Angela made herself a promise. If she got through this night, if she made it back to her courtroom, she would use this experience to make sure other people didn't have to go through what she was going through. She had no idea that her chance for justice was coming much sooner than she could have imagined, and in a way that would shock everyone involved. After an hour of waiting in the uncomfortable plastic chair, Angela was finally called for processing. A female officer led her to a small windowless room that smelled strongly of cleaning chemicals. The walls were painted an institutional green that seemed designed to make people feel worse than they already did. "Remove all jewelry and empty your pockets," the officer instructed in a monotone voice. Angela complied, placing her watch, earrings, and the contents of her pockets into a plastic tray. She had very little with her since her purse was still in her abandoned car, but she handed over everything she had. "Now we need to do a full search for contraband," the officer continued. Pulling on latex gloves, Angela's heart sank. She knew what this meant, and she knew she had no choice but to comply. The search was invasive and humiliating, conducted with an clinical efficiency that somehow made it feel even worse. The officer went through the motions as if Angela was just another body to be processed, not a human being with dignity and rights. Throughout the search, Angela tried to maintain her composure by thinking about legal precedents and constitutional law. She mentally reviewed cases about unreasonable searches and seizures, about the Fourth Amendment protections that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of treatment. But knowing her rights didn't make the experience any less degrading. When the search was finally over, Angela thought the worst was behind her. She was wrong. The same officer who had conducted the search was now looking at Angela's hair with obvious suspicion. Angela's natural hair was styled in locks that she had worn for years. They were neat, professional, and completely normal, but the officer was staring at them as if they were somehow dangerous. "We're going to need to search your hair," the officer announced. "You already did," Angela replied, confused. The officer had already run her hands through Angela's hair during the search. "No, I mean really search it. Hair like that can hide all kinds of things." Angela felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories about this kind of treatment, but she had never experienced it personally. The officer was talking about her natural black hair as if it was automatically suspicious, as if the way her hair grew out of her head was somehow a threat. "Officer, my hair was searched thoroughly during the initial examination," Angela said as calmly as she could manage. "There's nothing hidden in it." But the officer had already made up her mind. She called for backup, and soon the small room contained 3 officers, all looking at Angela as if she was a dangerous criminal, rather than a woman who had been driving home from work. "We're going to need to cut some of this off," one of the officers announced, producing a pair of scissors that looked like they belonged in a kitchen, rather than any kind of professional setting. Angela's blood ran cold. "That's completely unnecessary." "You've already searched my hair multiple times. It's for safety," another officer said, though nobody in the room could explain exactly whose safety was being protected by cutting off Angela's hair. Angela realized that this wasn't about safety or procedure. This was about humiliation. This was about taking away the last pieces of her dignity and making sure she knew exactly how powerless she was in this situation. "I need to speak to your supervisor," Angela said, trying one last time to maintain some control over the situation. The supervisor approved this. The first officer lied smoothly. Angela knew this wasn't true. She also knew that arguing further would only make things worse. She was trapped in a small room with 3 officers who clearly felt they could do whatever they wanted to her with no consequences. They made her sit in a metal chair while they roughly cut away sections of her hair. They weren't careful about it, and they weren't gentle. They cut more than was necessary, leaving uneven patches and bald spots that would take months to grow back. Angela closed her eyes and tried to transport herself mentally to somewhere else, anywhere else. The worst part wasn't the physical act of having her hair cut off. The worst part was the casual way they did it, chatting among themselves about their weekend plans while they systematically destroyed something that had taken her years to grow and maintain. They treated her hair, and by extension her, as if she was nothing more than an object to be processed. When they were finished, Angela looked in the small mirror they provided and barely recognized herself. Her professional appearance was gone. Her dignity felt shattered. She looked like someone who had been through a traumatic experience, which was exactly what had happened. "There," one of the officers said with satisfaction. "Much better." Angela was given a jail uniform to wear and led to a holding cell. The cell was small and cold, with a metal bench and nothing else. She sat down carefully, running her hands over her shorn head and trying not to cry. In all her years of legal training and practice, she had studied cases about police misconduct and civil rights violations. She had read about people who were mistreated by law enforcement, and she had always believed that the system would protect people like her, so educated professionals who knew their rights. Now, she understood that knowing your rights meant nothing if the people in power decided to ignore them. She understood that education and professional status offered no protection against officers who were determined to abuse their authority. As she sat in that cold cell, Angela began to think about all the people who had gone through similar experiences, but didn't have her knowledge of the law or her position in the legal system. How many others had been humiliated and degraded like this? How many had been too scared or too powerless to fight back? She made herself another promise in that moment. When she got out of there, she wouldn't just seek justice for herself. She would use this experience to fight for everyone who had been treated this way, everyone whose dignity had been stolen by officers who thought they were above the law. Angela had no way of knowing that her chance for justice was less than 12 hours away, or that it would come in a form that would shock everyone involved. Angela spent the longest night of her life in that cold holding cell. She didn't sleep at all, partly because the metal bench was so uncomfortable, but mostly because her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept replaying every moment of the evening, analyzing every decision she had made, and wondering if she could have done anything differently to avoid this outcome. Around 6 in the morning, a different officer appeared at her cell door. This one was older, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he had seen too much during his career. His name tag read, Sergeant Rodriguez, and his demeanor was notably different from the officers who had arrested her. "Morrison?" he called out, checking his clipboard. "Yes," Angela replied, standing up stiffly from the bench. "You're being released on your own recognizance. Come with me." Angela followed him through the maze of corridors back to the processing area. The station was busier now, with officers coming and going for the morning shift change. Several of them glanced at her as she walked by, and Angela was acutely aware of how she must look with her uneven, roughly cut hair and wrinkled jail uniform. At the processing desk, Sergeant Rodriguez handed her a manila envelope containing her personal belongings, her watch, earrings, and the few items that had been in her pockets when she was arrested. Her wallet was there too, though she noticed that several officers had handled it during the night. "You need to sign here," the sergeant said, pointing to a line on a form. Angela picked up the pen and signed her full name, Angela Morrison. It was a name she had signed thousands of times before, on court orders, legal documents, and official correspondence. But she had never signed it while being released from jail. Sergeant Rodriguez glanced down at the signature and then looked at the name more carefully. His expression changed slightly, as if something was bothering him. He looked at her face, then back at the paperwork, then at her face again. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Are you related to Judge Morrison, the one who works at the downtown courthouse?" Angela met his eyes directly. "I am Judge Morrison." The pen dropped from the sergeant's hand and clattered onto the floor. The color completely drained from his face as the implications of what she had just said hit him. He looked around the room quickly to see who else might have heard, then looked back at her with what appeared to be genuine horror. You're Judge Angela Morrison?" "The judge?" "Yes," Angela said simply. Sergeant Rodriguez sat down heavily in his chair, as if his legs had suddenly stopped working. He stared at the arrest report in front of him, then looked up at Angela's shorn hair, then back at the paperwork. She could practically see him putting together the pieces of what had happened. "Oh no," he whispered. "Oh no, no, no." The sergeant quickly shuffled through the papers, reading the charges and the officers' names. Angela watched as his expression went from shock to something approaching panic. He clearly understood exactly how serious this situation was. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I am so sorry. I had no idea." "If I had known who you were, would it have made a difference?" Angela asked. It was a genuine question. She wanted to know if her mistreatment was wrong because of who she was, or if it was wrong regardless of her identity. The sergeant struggled to answer. "It shouldn't have happened to anyone," he finally said. "But especially not to... I mean, you're a judge. You're part of the system." Angela nodded slowly. "So is everyone who gets arrested, Sergeant. We're all part of the same system." Word spread through the police station with lightning speed. Angela could hear whispered conversations starting up all around her. Officers who had been chatting casually a few minutes earlier were now huddled in small groups, talking in urgent, quiet tones. She heard her name mentioned several times, along with words like lawsuit and investigation. The two officers who had arrested her were apparently not on duty yet for the morning shift, which Angela thought was probably fortunate for them. She imagined that Sergeant Rodriguez would be having a very difficult conversation with them very soon. "Judge Morrison," the sergeant said, standing up and clearly struggling with what to say next. "Is there anything we can do?" "Anything at all?" Angela looked around the police station. Many of the officers were now staring at her openly, some with curiosity, others with what looked like fear. She realized that for most of them, she had been transformed in an instant from a criminal suspect to one of the most powerful people in their professional lives. "I need a ride to my car," she said calmly, "assuming it's still where your officers left it." Of course, Sergeant Rodriguez said, grabbing his keys. "I'll drive you personally." As they walked toward the exit, Angela could feel dozens of eyes following her. The morning shift was now fully aware that they were looking at a sitting judge who had spent the night in their jail. A judge whose hair had been forcibly cut off by their colleagues. A judge who would be returning to her courtroom later that morning. During the quiet drive back to where her car had been abandoned, Sergeant Rodriguez tried to make conversation several times, but seemed to keep running out of words. Finally, he just said, This is going to be a problem, isn't it? Angela looked out the window at the city waking up around them. It's already a problem, Sergeant. The question is what we're going to do about it. When they arrived at the location where she had been pulled over, Angela's car was still there, still open, with her belongings still scattered around it. Amazingly, nothing seemed to have been stolen, though her papers were damp with morning dew, and some had blown quite far from the vehicle. Angela spent 20 minutes collecting her things and putting her car back together. Sergeant Rodriguez helped her, apologizing repeatedly as they gathered up her work files and personal items. When everything was back in the car, he stood there awkwardly, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing what. "Judge Morrison?" he finally managed. "What happens now?" Angela adjusted the rearview mirror and caught sight of her reflection. Her hair was a disaster, uneven and patchy where it had been roughly cut, but her eyes were clear and determined. She looked like someone who had been through something terrible but had survived it. "Now I go home and get ready for work," she said. "I have court this morning." As she drove away, Angela had no idea that two of the officers who would be appearing in her courtroom that very day were the same ones who had arrested her the night before. She couldn't have imagined the looks on their faces when they realized who was sitting behind the judge's bench. Justice, she was about to learn, sometimes works in very unexpected ways. Angela drove home in the early morning sunlight, feeling like she was seeing her city with completely new eyes. These were the same streets she had driven for years, the same neighborhoods where she felt safe and comfortable. But after spending the night in jail, everything looked different somehow. She found herself noticing things she had never paid attention to before. The way police cars seemed to be everywhere. The way certain intersections felt more threatening than others. When she pulled into her driveway, her house looked exactly the same as when she had left it the day before. The porch light was still on, her morning newspaper was sitting on the front step, and her neighbor's dog was barking its usual greeting. But Angela felt like a completely different person than the woman who had left this house yesterday evening. Inside, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and stopped short. In the harsh morning light, her hair looked even worse than it had in the jail. The cuts were jagged and uneven, with some sections much shorter than others. There were bald patches where the officers had been particularly rough. She looked like someone who had been in an accident or had suffered some kind of trauma, which she supposed was exactly what had happened. Angela went upstairs to her bathroom and studied her reflection more carefully. She tried combing her hair different ways, but there was no styling that could hide what had been done to her. The damage was too severe and too obvious. She would need professional help to fix this, but she didn't have time for that now. She had to be in court in 3 hours. She showered and tried to wash away the smell of jail, that combination of disinfectant, fear, and institutional neglect that seemed to cling to everything in that building. The hot water felt wonderful after the cold night in the cell, and for a few minutes she almost felt human again. But when she got out of the shower and looked in the mirror again, the reality of her situation hit her full force. She was a sitting judge who had been arrested, jailed, and humiliated by the very police officers who regularly testified in her courtroom. How could she possibly face her colleagues today? How could she maintain her authority and dignity when everyone would be able to see exactly what had been done to her? Angela opened her closet and selected her most professional outfit, a sharp black suit that she wore for important hearings. She put on her judicial robes over it, hoping they would provide some sense of armor for what was sure to be a difficult day. But when she looked in the mirror, her damaged hair was still visible above the collar of her robes. Then she remembered something. In the back of her closet was a collection of headscarves and wraps that she had inherited from her grandmother. Angela had never worn them to work before, thinking they might seem too informal for the courtroom. But today they seemed perfect. She selected a beautiful deep blue head wrap made of silk that her grandmother had brought back from a trip to West Africa many years ago. As Angela carefully wrapped it around her head, covering the damaged areas of her hair, she felt a strange sense of connection to the generations of strong women who had come before her. Her grandmother had faced her own struggles with dignity and grace. Now it was Angela's turn. When she was finished, she looked in the mirror again. The head wrap was elegant and regal, and it completely transformed her appearance. Instead of looking like a victim, she looked like a queen. Instead of looking damaged, she looked powerful. The contrast between what the officers had intended to do to her dignity and how she actually looked now was striking. Angela arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, as was her habit. But word of her arrest had somehow already spread through the legal community. Her clerk, Patricia, was waiting for her with a concerned expression and a cup of fresh coffee. "Judge Morrison," Patricia said quietly, closing the office door behind them. "Are you all right? I heard about what happened last night." Angela wasn't surprised that the news had traveled so quickly. The legal community in their city was small, and courthouse gossip moved at the speed of light. She wondered how many people already knew the details of her arrest and humiliation. "I'm fine, Patricia," Angela said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "What's on the schedule for today?" Patricia consulted her notes, but Angela could see that she was trying not to stare at the head wrap. "You have several hearings this morning, including 2 cases where police officers are scheduled to testify." Angela felt her stomach tighten. "Which officers?" Patricia checked her file. "Officers Davidson and Turner are testifying in the robbery case, and Officers Chen and Williams are scheduled for the drug possession hearing." Angela breathed a small sigh of relief. None of those were the officers who had arrested her. She wasn't sure she was ready for that confrontation yet. "There's something else," Patricia said hesitantly. "There are reporters outside. They're asking questions about your arrest." Angela's heart sank. She had hoped to have at least a day to process what had happened before it became a public story, but she should have known better. A sitting judge being arrested was big news, especially when the circumstances were as questionable as they had been in her case. "What kind of questions?" Angela asked. "They want to know if you're planning to press charges against the officers. They're asking about potential lawsuits and whether you think you were targeted because of your race." Angela sat down at her desk and took a sip of her coffee. She had been so focused on getting through the immediate aftermath of her arrest that she hadn't really thought about the bigger picture. But Patricia was right. This was going to be a major story. Her treatment at the hands of those officers wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was going to be scrutinized by the media, the legal community, and the public. "Have any other judges or court officials made statements?" Angela asked. "Judge Peterson called this morning. He wanted to make sure you were okay and to offer his support. Judge Williams sent flowers." Patricia gestured toward a large arrangement on the side table that Angela hadn't noticed before. Angela was touched by the support from her colleagues, but she also felt a heavy weight of responsibility. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. Every decision she made about how to handle this situation would reflect on the entire judicial system. As she sat in her chambers, preparing for the day ahead, Angela had no idea that in just a few hours she would be looking down from her bench at the 2 officers who had arrested her. She couldn't have imagined the moment when they would walk into her courtroom and realize who was wearing the judge's robes. But first, she had other cases to handle, and other people seeking justice. Despite everything that had happened to her, Angela was still a judge, and people were counting on her to do her job fairly and impartially. That responsibility felt heavier than ever, but it was also what gave her strength. She adjusted her head wrap one more time, straightened her robes, and prepared to face whatever the day would bring. Angela had been on the bench for 2 hours, handling routine hearings and maintaining her usual professional demeanor, despite the events of the previous night. Her head wrap had drawn some curious glances from lawyers and court staff, but no one had asked any questions. The morning was proceeding normally, and Angela was beginning to feel like she might get through the day without any major incidents. Then Patricia appeared at her elbow during a brief recess. "Judge Morrison," she whispered, "the next case is the Henderson assault hearing. Officers Davidson and Turner are here to testify." Angela nodded and looked down at her case file, but Patricia wasn't finished. "I'm sorry, Judge, but there's been a change. Officers Davidson and Turner called in sick this morning. They're being replaced by Officers Walsh and Thompson." Angela's blood turned to ice in her veins. Walsh and Thompson. Those were the names she had seen on the arrest report the night before. Those were the officers who had pulled her over, searched her car, arrested her, and ultimately been responsible for the humiliation she had endured. "Are you sure about those names?" Angela asked quietly. Patricia double-checked her notes. "Yes, ma'am. Officers Walsh and Thompson from the downtown precinct. They're already here, waiting in the witness room." Angela felt her hands begin to shake slightly, and she clasped them together in her lap where no one could see. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating all morning. In just a few minutes, the two men who had treated her so cruelly the night before would walk into her courtroom, expecting to see just another judge they could manipulate with their testimony. Judge Morrison? Patricia was looking at her with concern. Are you all right? Angela took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. I'm fine. Let's proceed with the hearing. When court reconvened, Angela watched as the defendant and his attorney took their places at the defense table. The prosecutor was reviewing his notes, preparing to present the case. Everything looked completely normal, like any other day in any other courtroom. Then the bailiff announced, "The state calls Officer Walsh to the stand." Angela's heart was pounding as the courtroom doors opened. Officer Walsh walked in first, looking confident and casual as he approached the witness stand. He was wearing his dress uniform, his badge polished and his appearance neat and professional. This was clearly a man who was comfortable testifying in court, who expected to be treated with deference and respect by judges and juries alike. He was halfway to the witness stand before he looked up at the bench and saw who was sitting there. Angela watched as recognition dawned in his eyes. His confident stride faltered for just a moment and his face went pale. But he was a professional, and he recovered quickly, continuing to the witness stand as if nothing had happened. Angela could see him trying to process what he was seeing, trying to figure out if she was really who he thought she was. Officer Thompson entered the courtroom a moment later, preparing to wait his turn to testify. He was chatting quietly with the prosecutor when he glanced toward the bench. Angela saw the exact moment when he recognized her. His conversation stopped mid-sentence and he stared at her with undisguised shock. Angela maintained perfect judicial composure throughout the swearing-in process. Her voice was steady and professional as she addressed Officer Walsh. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." "Officer Richard Walsh, Downtown Precinct," he replied, his voice slightly hoarse. "And how long have you been with the police department, Officer Walsh?" 15 years, Your Honor." Angela noted the emphasis he put on Your Honor as if he was trying to convince himself that she was really a judge. She could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to reconcile the woman he had arrested and humiliated the night before with the figure of authority now sitting above him in judicial robes. The prosecutor began his direct examination, asking Officer Walsh to describe the incident that had led to the defendant's arrest. Angela listened carefully, noting the officer's testimony and comparing it to what she knew about police procedures and constitutional rights. As Walsh testified, Angela began to notice troubling patterns in his account. His description of probable cause seemed thin. His explanation of the defendant's alleged resistance sounded familiar in an uncomfortable way, and his justification for the level of force used was questionable at best. When it came time for cross-examination, the defense attorney began asking pointed questions about the officer's training and adherence to department policies. Walsh's answers became more defensive, and Angela could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. "Officer Walsh," the defense attorney asked, "are you familiar with the department's policy regarding respectful treatment of all citizens during police encounters?" Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes, I am." "And do you always follow those policies?" There was a long pause before Walsh answered. "Yes, I do." Angela found herself studying Walsh's demeanor carefully. Less than 24 hours ago, this man had treated her with contempt and cruelty. He had participated in violating her constitutional rights and had shown no concern for her dignity or well-being. Now he was sitting in her courtroom, claiming to always treat citizens with respect. When Officer Thompson took the stand, the dynamic was even more intense. Thompson was younger and less experienced than Walsh, and his nervousness was obvious from the moment he sat down. He kept glancing at Angela as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. His testimony contradicted Walsh's account in several small but significant ways. Angela made careful notes of each inconsistency, remembering her training about how to evaluate witness credibility and reliability. During Thompson's cross-examination, the defense attorney pressed him about his recollection of events. Thompson stumbled over his answers, changed his story twice, and eventually admitted that some details were unclear in his memory. "Officer Thompson," the defense attorney asked, "is it possible that your recollection of this incident is influenced by other arrests you've made recently?" Thompson's eyes darted toward Angela before he answered. "I don't think so. Have you made any other arrests in the past 24 hours?" Angela held her breath. This was the moment when everything could come out in open court, when her arrest and the circumstances surrounding it could become part of the public record in this hearing. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer. Finally, he said, "I may have, but I don't see how that's relevant to this case." The defense attorney was about to follow up when Angela intervened. "I think we have sufficient testimony on this point. Let's move on." She wasn't protecting the officers, but she also wasn't ready for her personal situation to become part of this hearing. That was a decision she needed to make carefully, not something that should come out in a random criminal case. After both officers finished testifying, Angela took a brief recess to consider the evidence. As the courtroom emptied, she remained on the bench, thinking about what she had just witnessed. Both officers had testified under oath about their commitment to following proper procedures and treating all citizens with respect. Both had presented themselves as professional, trustworthy law enforcement officers who could be relied upon to tell the truth. Angela knew from personal experience that both of those representations were false. These men had violated her rights, humiliated her, and shown callous disregard for justice and human dignity. Yet here they were, being treated as credible witnesses in a criminal case where someone's freedom was at stake. When court reconvened, Angela delivered her ruling. Based on the inconsistencies in the officer's testimony and the questionable circumstances of the arrest, she found that the defendant's rights had been violated and dismissed the charges. As the officers left her courtroom, Angela could see the confusion and concern in their faces. They knew something significant had happened, but they weren't sure what it meant for their futures. Angela knew that this was just the beginning. The real reckoning was yet to come. After the hearing ended, Angela remained in her chambers for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, and she could see people going about their daily lives, lawyers heading home from work, court staff leaving for the day, citizens coming and going from various legal proceedings. From her window, the city looked peaceful and orderly, but Angela now understood that beneath that calm surface, there were serious problems with the system she had dedicated her career to serving. The two officers who had just left her courtroom were still on duty, still carrying badges and guns, still having the power to arrest and humiliate other citizens. That evening, Angela made one of the most difficult decisions of her professional life. She called a press conference and announced that she would be filing formal complaints against officers Walsh and Thompson for their conduct during her arrest. She also announced that she would be requesting a full investigation into the policies and training practices of the downtown precinct. The story exploded across local and national media within hours. Videos of Angela's press conference, where she appeared dignified and composed in her elegant head wrap, went viral on social media. People from around the country began sharing their own stories of police misconduct and excessive force. What struck many people wasn't just what had happened to Angela, but how she had handled it. She didn't seek revenge or make emotional accusations. Instead, she used the proper legal channels to seek accountability and reform. She turned her personal trauma into a catalyst for systemic change. The investigation that followed was thorough and damning. Internal Affairs discovered that Walsh and Thompson had a pattern of excessive force complaints, particularly involving African American citizens. Security cameras from the police station revealed that Angela's treatment had been even worse than she had initially reported. Several other officers came forward to report incidents they had witnessed but had been afraid to report previously. Within 3 months, both officers were terminated from the police department. The city ultimately paid a significant settlement to Angela, but she donated the entire amount to organizations working on police reform and civil rights advocacy. The changes that followed went far beyond just 2 officers losing their jobs. The police department implemented new training programs focused on constitutional rights and respectful treatment of all citizens. Body cameras became mandatory for all traffic stops. The Civilian Oversight Board was given more authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. Angela continued to wear her head wraps occasionally, even after her hair had grown back. What had been intended as a symbol of her humiliation became a symbol of her strength and resilience. Other professional women in the community began wearing head wraps as well, creating an unspoken show of solidarity and pride. 6 months after her arrest, Angela was invited to speak at a national conference on judicial reform. As she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of judges, lawyers, and civil rights advocates, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night on the highway. "I learned something important during my experience," she told the audience. "Justice isn't just about what happens in the courtroom. It's about what happens on the street corner, in the police station, and in every interaction between citizens and their government. When we fail to protect the rights of any citizen, we weaken the foundation of justice for everyone." The speech received a standing ovation, but Angela was most proud of the letters she received afterward, from ordinary people who said her story had inspired them to stand up for their own rights or to get involved in their communities. One letter came from a young woman who had been considering dropping out of law school after facing discrimination and discouragement from professors. She wrote that seeing Angela's grace under pressure had convinced her to continue her studies. She was now planning to specialize in civil rights law. Another letter came from a police officer from a different city who said Angela's story had made him reflect on his own conduct and treatment of citizens. He had started volunteering with community organizations to build better relationships between police and the neighborhoods they served. Perhaps the most meaningful letter came from a teenager who had been arrested under questionable circumstances similar to Angela's. The young man wrote that seeing a judge who understood what he had gone through gave him faith that the system could actually work for people like him. As the first anniversary of her arrest approached, Angela was asked by a reporter if she regretted what had happened to her that night. She thought carefully before answering. "I regret that it happened," she said. "I regret that any citizen has to go through that kind of treatment. But I don't regret the changes that came from it. If my experience helped prevent other people from being treated the way I was treated, then something good came from something terrible." Angela had learned that sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. Her worst night had become the catalyst for some of the most important work of her career. She had discovered that true strength isn't about avoiding difficult situations, but about how you respond when those situations find you. Today, Angela continues to serve as a judge, but she's also become a national voice for police reform and civil rights. She speaks regularly at conferences and law schools, sharing her story and advocating for systemic changes that will protect all citizens' constitutional rights. The head wrap that had once covered her shame now sits in a place of honor in her chambers, a reminder that dignity can never truly be taken away. It can only be given away, and Angela had refused to give hers away, even in her darkest hour. Officers Walsh and Thompson, meanwhile, struggled to find work in law enforcement after their termination. The investigation into their conduct had become part of their permanent records, and police departments across the region were unwilling to hire officers with their history of misconduct. In the end, Angela's story became proof that the system can work when people of conscience are willing to stand up for what's right. Even when it's difficult and even when they're standing alone, her courage in speaking out had created ripple effects that would protect countless other citizens for years to come. Justice had been served, not through revenge or retaliation, but through accountability, reform, and the quiet power of one person's refusal to let injustice go unchallenged.